campers, families, and friends. It's Sarah at Vin's Nature Camp, and I want to welcome you back to this week's Campfire Stories. We're keeping our campfire tradition alive, so I hope you have your s'more supplies ready. Just like we did last week, we're going to start today with a moment of reflection. So thinking back on the week we've just had, at every campfire, we always give everyone a chance who wants to share their favorite memory from the week. For me, I had a pretty great week. It was tough to choose, but the memory that I want to share today is of watching a pair of ravens build a nest. They've picked a tree near my house in the woods and have been busy every day this week flying back and forth with sticks. It's been really cool to watch them at work. What's your favorite memory? So at this point, take a minute and pause the video if you want to, and think back on all the good that's happened this week, and share a favorite if you would like to. Great, now that everyone's had a chance to share, we can begin today's stories. Today I've chosen two stories again that have to do with things that are happening in the world right now. Our first story comes from the book Keepers of Life. You'll probably remember last week we read two stories from Keepers of the Earth. This is a collection of books, all Native American stories compiled by Michael Caduto and Joseph Bruchac. Our first story is called How Chalet Made the People and the Seasons. This is from the Lenni Lenape people of the Eastern Woodlands. Long ago, Chalet, the creator, built the world. First, he caused a great turtle to rise up from the depths of the water and float on the surface. Then, Chalet took moist earth and placed it on the back of the giant turtle as the turtle floated in the endless ocean. The ridges of Turtle's back turned into mountains, and grass and shrubs and trees of all kinds began to grow from the soil. It went on this way for some time, but Chalet felt that something was yet to be made. There were birds and animals and living things of all kinds, but there was something missing. Chalet considered shaping beings from the stones of earth, but such beings would be heavy-footed and they would crush the plants beneath them. Instead, Chalet made a straight ash tree grow up tall. From its branches, the first men and first women sprouted. Then, Chalet placed the sun in the day sky and the moon in the night sky. And so that all would grow and rest in its proper time, Chalet created the four directions and the seasons, which would come from each of those directions. West and north and east were grandfathers, governing the times of fall and winter and spring. South was a grandmother, bringing the warmth of new life of summer. Like the trees and the plants, human beings grew to love that time of year and their grandmother South best of all. Then, Chalet decided to make sure the divisions between the seasons were fair and acceptable. It will be this way, Chalet said. Each year there will be a contest between Grandfather North and Grandmother South. They will play the hand game. One will take a bead and hide it in one hand or the other, so that the opponent must guess which hand it is in. Each will have 12 sticks, and each time a winning guess is made, one stick will be taken. Whenever Grandmother South begins to win more sticks, the weather will begin to turn warm and spring will come. But when her luck begins to change, autumn will be a signal that Grandfather North is winning his sticks back again. And so it is to this day, because the game between Grandmother South and Grandfather North is so evenly matched. The seasons are always about the same length, but as in every game, sometimes one of them has better luck than the other, And so we never know for sure when each season will begin or end. So that story is explaining the seasons and how even when we have seasons that are pretty regular, why some years can be so different from the prior years. Like last year, if you had seen me in my yard, I had snowbanks up over my head. But this year you can see all the snow's already melted. We've had an early spring this year, but that's not always the case. And the people who told this story observed those changes too, and those year-to-year differences. So the most important thing to help us explain those differences that we have in science now is the understanding that seasons and seasonal weather patterns are two very different things. Last week we talked a little bit about the seasons and our understanding that the seasons are caused because of the tilt of the Earth's axis and its rotation around the sun, and how that changes throughout the year. Every year, we can expect the arrival of the official first day of spring around March 20th. And that's because that's when the vernal equinox happens. Now, an equinox is when the length of the day and the night are the same about all around the world. And it happens twice a year, in the spring and in the fall. Now, seasonal weather, as we know and have observed, can vary greatly. I have seen snowstorms at the end of May, and there have been years like this one where all the snow is gone before the end of March. It kind of is a luck of the draw in a way. Even with all of our modern understanding in science, we can't actually predict in what years we're going to have an early spring or a late one. Even though Punxsutawney Phil did get it right this year with his prediction of an early spring, that doesn't always happen, and we don't have any real scientific understanding of how to predict those types of weather patterns. So, in a way, it is kind of like our story. It can be, or can seem, like a complete luck of the draw if we're going to be welcoming an early spring, or if we're going to have to keep our winter clothes out for a couple more months. Now, our next story is from Keepers of the Animals, another one of the books in this collection. And it is called The Woman Who Married a Frog. It's from the Tlingit people of the Pacific Northwest. There was once a young woman who was very proud. She was the daughter of the town chief, and her family was very respected. Many of the young men wanted to marry her, but she thought none of them were good enough for her. One day, she was walking with her sister beside the big lake near their village. There were many frogs in that lake. A large number of them were sitting on a mud bank in the middle of the lake, and she began to make fun of them. "How ugly these frogs are," she said. Then she bent over and picked one up, which was sitting on the muddy shore, looking up at her. "You are so ugly," she said to the frog. "Even another frog would not want to marry you." Then she threw the frog back in the lake. That night, she stepped outside of her lodge to walk while the others were sleeping. She was surprised to see a young man standing there. His clothing was decorated with green beads, and he seemed very handsome. "I have come to marry you," the young man said. "Come with me to my father's house." The young woman agreed. She thought she had never seen such a handsome man before. "We must climb the hill to go to my father's house," the young man said, and he pointed toward the lake. They began to walk down toward the water, but it seemed to the young woman that they were climbing a hill. When they reached the water, they did not stop, but they went under. The next day, her family realized she was missing. They searched for her everywhere, and when they found her tracks leading to the water, they knew she had drowned. They beat the drums for a funeral. People cut their hair and blackened their faces and mourned. One day, though, a man walked down by the lake. When he looked out toward its middle, he saw on the mud bank many frogs sitting. There, in the midst of the frogs, was the chief's missing daughter. He began to wade in toward them, but they leapt into the water, taking the young woman with them. The man went as quickly as he could to the chief's house. "I have seen your daughter," he said. "She has been taken by the frogs. I tried to reach her, but the frogs took her back with them under the water." The young woman's father and mother went down to the lake. There they saw their daughter sitting on the mud bank, surrounded by frogs. As before, when they tried to reach her, the frogs dove in and carried her back into the lake with them. Then the chief's other daughter spoke. "My sister insulted the frogs," she said. "That is why they have taken her." The chief saw then what he must do. He made offerings to the frogs, asking them to forgive his daughter. They placed dishes of food on the surface of the water. The dishes floated out and sank. But the frogs would not give up the young woman. They placed robes of fine skins on the banks. The young women and the frogs came to the bank and took those robes. But when the chief came close, the frogs drew back into the lake. The frogs would not give her up. At last the chief made a plan. He gathered together all of the people in the village. "We will dig a trench," he said. "We will drain away the water of the lake and rescue my daughter." The people worked for a long time, and the water began to drain away. The frogs tried to fill the trench with mud, but they could not stop the water from flowing out. The frogs tried to drive the people away, but the people only picked the frogs up and dropped them back into the water. They were careful not to hurt any of the frogs, but they did not stop digging the trench. The water continued to flow out, and the homes of the frogs were being destroyed. At last the chief of the frogs decided. It was his son who had married the young woman. "We are not strong enough to fight these humans," he said. "We must give my new daughter back to her people." So they brought the young woman to the trench. Her father and mother saw her, and they pulled her out. She was covered with mud and smelled like a frog. One frog leaped out of the water after her. It was the frog who had been her husband, but the people carefully picked him up and dropped him back in the lake. They took the young woman home. For a long time, she could only speak as a frog does. Rabbit, rabbit, rabbit. Finally, she learned to speak like a human again. "The frogs know our language," she told the people. "We must not talk badly about them." From that day on, her people showed great respect to frogs. They learned the songs the woman brought from the frogs, and they used the frog as their emblem. They had learned a great lesson. They never forgot what happened to the young woman who was too proud. To this day, some people in the village say that when they hear the frogs singing in the lake, the frogs are telling their children this story too. So I chose that story because one of the sure signs of spring is when you can hear the peepers calling from ponds. And every night this week, I've been able to hear the peepers in the pond near my house. Now, amphibians have to lay their eggs in water. And so ponds are places where they gather in the springtime to find mates so that they can breed for the year. And that's why we hear all of those calls happening from those ponds this time of year, because the amphibians are starting to return from wherever they overwintered, and they're starting to try and find a mate. I hope you all enjoyed this week's stories. I look forward to welcoming you back next week. And now it's time to enjoy some s'mores.